Close your eyes. Let the noise of today find somewhere else to be. Not all at once, just slowly. The way a room grows quiet after the last person leaves, and you realize, for the first time in hours, that you can finally breathe. Maybe tonight you are tired in a way that is hard to name. Not just the tiredness that comes from a long day, the deeper kind. The kind that has been accumulating for longer than you can remember, from carrying things that were heavy and showing up anyway and trying to hold together a life that sometimes feels like it is asking more of you than you have left to give. If that is where you are tonight, I want you to know something before we begin. You are not the first person to feel that way. The people in this story felt it too. The women who walked to a tomb before sunrise because they did not know what else to do. The men who locked the doors and sat in the dark because the thing they had built their lives around had ended on a Friday afternoon. The one who prayed alone in a garden while his closest friends fell asleep around him. They were tired too. And what happened to them, in the middle of their tiredness, in the middle of a week that asked everything of them and gave back things they had not expected, is what we are going to walk through together tonight. This is Holy Week. 7 days that changed everything, not as a lesson to be absorbed before sleep, but as a story to be walked through slowly, the way you walk through something that is too large to be taken in all at once. Breathe. You are safe here. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Last Journey Toward Jerusalem. Before we talk about what happened in that final week, we need to understand the road that led into it. Because Passover was coming. And in the first century, Passover was not simply a religious observance. It was the single most significant event in the Jewish calendar. The one moment each year when every Jewish man within a reasonable distance of Jerusalem was expected by tradition and by law to make the journey to the city. They came from Galilee in the north, from communities scattered across the Roman world, from villages and farms and fishing towns that were weeks of travel away. Historians who study this period estimate, based on the accounts of ancient writers like Josephus and what we know of Jerusalem's infrastructure, that the city's population during Passover week may have swelled dramatically from its ordinary size, with figures suggested by various scholars ranging widely, some reaching into the hundreds of thousands. What is not disputed is this. The roads into Jerusalem during Passover were crowded in a way that happened at no other time of year. Every road leading toward the city would have been filled with pilgrims. Families walking together, the older ones who had made this journey many times, and the younger ones for whom everything was still new. The sound of sandals on stone, the smell of dust and olive groves, and the particular dry warmth of the Judean hills in spring. Songs being sung as people walked. The Psalms of Ascent, Psalms 120 through 134, were composed specifically for this journey. Pilgrims would sing them as they climbed the roads toward the city. I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Jesus and his disciples had been in Galilee. The journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, depending on the route taken, covered somewhere between 70 and 100 miles on foot. Most pilgrims took the route through the Jordan River Valley, dropping down from the hills of Galilee, following the river south through the flat land of the valley floor, and then climbing back up through the Judean wilderness toward the city. It was a journey that took several days. He had made this journey before. Every year of his life as a faithful Jewish man, he would have walked these roads toward Passover. He knew the sound of other pilgrims singing on the road. He knew the particular quality of the light in the Judean hills in spring. He knew what Jerusalem looked like from a distance when you finally crested the last ridge and the city came into view. But this year was different. He knew it was different. This is the part of the story that deserves to be held carefully before we move forward. Because it is easy to read what happened next and miss the weight of it. Jesus had told his disciples, more than once, what was waiting for him in Jerusalem. He had told them plainly, months before, that he would be handed over to the chief priests, that he would be condemned, that he would be killed, and that on the third day he would rise. The disciples had heard the words and had not been able to take them in. Peter had pulled him aside and said, "These things must never happen to you." They could not reconcile what he was saying with what they expected the Messiah to be. But he knew. He walked toward Jerusalem knowing what the week would contain. And he walked toward it anyway. Not because he had no choice, but because this was the reason he had come. Breathe. Let that sit for a moment. A man walking knowingly toward the hardest thing imaginable, with clear eyes and a settled purpose, because on the other side of it was something that could not be reached any other way. Most of us, when we see something hard ahead of us, look for a way around it. He looked at it directly and kept walking. The group stopped in Jericho on their way up. Jericho is one of the oldest inhabited cities on earth, sitting in the Jordan Valley well below sea level, surrounded by the particular greenness that comes from a strong water source in otherwise dry terrain. The road from Jericho to Jerusalem climbs steeply through the Judean wilderness, a stretch of rocky hills and narrow passes that travelers in that era found genuinely difficult. The parable Jesus told about the Good Samaritan was set on exactly this road, which tells you something about its reputation among those who walked it regularly. In Jericho, two encounters happened that the Gospel writers considered worth preserving. The first was with a tax collector named Zacchaeus, a small man who had climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus above the crowd, and who came down to discover that Jesus intended to eat dinner at his house that evening. Tax collectors in first-century Judea occupied a particular place in their society. They were Jews who had contracted with the Roman government to collect taxes from their own people, and they were permitted by the system to collect more than was strictly owed and keep the difference. They were considered by many of their neighbors to have traded their dignity and their community for money. They were excluded from synagogue life. They were, in the view of most people around them, beyond the reach of ordinary respectability. Jesus looked up into the tree and said he was going to his house today. The second encounter was with a blind man named Bartimaeus. He sat at the side of the road as the Passover crowd passed by, and when he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was coming, he began to shout above the noise, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The people around him told him to be quiet. He shouted louder, and Jesus stopped. In the Gospels, Jesus stops for people that crowds have decided do not matter. He stopped for lepers and for a woman who reached out in desperation to touch the edge of his garment. He stopped for children when his disciples were trying to move the day along. And here he stopped for a blind beggar on a dusty road in Jericho when hundreds of Passover pilgrims were waiting to continue their journey. He asked Bartimaeus a question. "What do you want me to do for you?" The question might seem obvious. The man was blind. But there is something in the asking that matters. He did not assume. He wanted to hear it said. He wanted this man, who had spent his life being passed by, to be heard by someone who was actually listening. "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Bartimaeus could see. He followed Jesus on the road. The road now climbing out of Jericho and heading up through the wilderness toward Jerusalem. The road that rises more than 3,000 feet in elevation over roughly 17 miles, winding through limestone hills that in Jesus' day offered little shade and much open sky. The songs of ascent would have been audible from various points along this route, other pilgrims singing the ancient words as they climbed. Pilgrims who had been making this journey every year of their lives, carrying the same words their parents had carried and their grandparents before them. All the way back to the first time those words were sung on a road just like this one. They came up through the wilderness and arrived at the villages on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. Bethphage and Bethany, sitting close together on the hillside, about 2 miles from Jerusalem. Bethany was a place Jesus knew well. This is worth pausing on. Across all four Gospels, it becomes clear that Bethany held a particular place in Jesus' life during his Jerusalem visits. This was where Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus lived. This was the family where, not long before this final journey, something had happened that had rippled outward through the surrounding region in ways that the religious authorities found deeply unsettling. Lazarus had become sick, had died, had been in the tomb 4 days. And Jesus had stood outside that tomb and called him out of it. The Gospel of John makes clear that the raising of Lazarus was not a quiet event. Many people had been present, and many of those people had gone and told the Pharisees what they had seen. It was, in significant ways, the moment that made the decision of the religious leaders final. A man who could raise the dead was a man they could no longer afford to leave unchallenged. And Jesus came back to Bethany. He came back to the house of the family he loved, in the village where he was known, on the night before the week that would change everything. The Gospels tell us he returned to Bethany each evening during Holy Week. He did not sleep in Jerusalem after the crowds went home. He came back each night to this small village on the hillside, to this house, to these people. That detail moves me every time I sit with it. In the middle of the most significant week in human history, he went home at night. Not to a palace or a place of honor, to a house in a small village where people knew his name and were glad to see him and set a place for him at the table. He rested there. Breathe. The night air in Bethany would have been cool. The Mount of Olives rising behind the village, covered in olive trees that were ancient even then. The lights of Jerusalem visible from the higher ground, perhaps 2 miles away. The sound of a city settling into evening, full of pilgrims who had come from every direction for the feast. He knew what the morning would bring. He rested anyway. There is something in that, in the deliberate choice to rest in the middle of a story this large, that reaches across 2,000 years and touches something in the person lying awake tonight. You are not required to solve everything before you sleep. You are not required to carry the full weight of what tomorrow contains. He knew exactly what was coming, and he still closed his eyes in Bethany. You can close yours too. Tomorrow, in Jerusalem, a week would begin that no one in that city fully understood was happening. The pilgrims filling the roads would celebrate Passover as they had every year. The priests would perform their rituals. The Roman soldiers would keep their uneasy watch. And into all of that, a man from Galilee would ride into the city on a donkey, and nothing would ever be the same. But that is tomorrow. Tonight he is in Bethany, and we are with him. Rest now. The road has been long, and the week ahead is still ahead. Let your body grow heavy. Let the sound of pilgrims singing on the road and the particular quiet of a small village at night settle around you like something warm. You do not need to carry the whole story tonight, just the part that belongs to you. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we walk into Jerusalem. Chapter 2. Palm Sunday. The King Who Rode a Donkey. The morning began quietly. It always does in the Gospels before something large happens. A stillness first. A moment where the world has not yet caught up to what is about to occur. And then everything moves at once. Jesus woke in Bethany. The village around him was already stirring. Passover week had begun in earnest, and the roads leading into Jerusalem would have been filling before sunrise, with pilgrims who wanted to reach the temple courts early, who wanted to find their footing in the city before the crowds became impossible to move through. The smell of cook fires, families gathering their things, the particular energy of a holy day that has been anticipated for weeks finally arriving. He called 2 of his disciples. He gave them specific instructions. They were to go into the next village, just ahead on the road. When they entered it, they would find a young donkey tied there, one that had never been ridden. They were to untie it and bring it. If anyone asked what they were doing, they were to say simply that the Lord had need of it. The disciples went. They found the donkey exactly where he said it would be. The owners asked why they were untying it, and they said what they had been told to say, and the owners let them take it. This small detail is easy to read past, but the precision of it, the donkey in exactly the right place, the owners responding exactly as he said they would, tells us something about the way Jesus moved through this week. He was not reacting to events as they unfolded. He was not being swept along by circumstance. He was walking a road he had seen clearly, step by deliberate step, from the beginning. They brought the donkey. They laid their cloaks across its back, and he sat on it. And here we need to stop, because what Jesus did in this moment was not simply choose a humble mode of transportation. He was doing something that many in that crowd, those who knew their scriptures, would have recognized immediately. 500 years before this morning, the prophet Zechariah had written these words, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." 500 years. The Jewish people had carried this prophecy through exile and occupation and through the long silence of centuries. And now a man from Galilee was riding a donkey down the Mount of Olives toward the eastern gate of Jerusalem on the very morning that Passover lambs were being brought into the city for inspection before the feast. The crowd understood that something significant was happening, or they understood part of it. They began to cut branches from the palm trees and lay them on the road. They spread their cloaks on the ground before him, and they began to shout. The word they shouted was, Hosanna. It is a word that has traveled through so many centuries of religious use that we have almost forgotten what it originally meant. In Hebrew, Hosanna is not a word of pure praise. It is a word of urgent appeal. It means, save us now. It was the cry of people who had been waiting a very long time for someone to come and make things right. Save us now. They were shouting it at the top of their voices. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. The procession moved down the slope of the Mount of Olives toward the city. Now, many scholars who study the political and social context of first-century Jerusalem have noted an additional layer to this scene that is worth considering carefully. Some historians have suggested that during Passover week, when the city filled with large numbers of pilgrims and the potential for unrest was at its highest, the Roman governor would travel from his usual residence on the Mediterranean coast to Jerusalem with a visible military escort as a deliberate show of Roman authority. If such a procession occurred during this same Passover week, the contrast in the city that day would have been striking. Imperial power entering with horses and weapons, and the full weight of Rome behind it. And on the other side of the city, a man on a borrowed donkey surrounded by people laying cloaks on the road. Whether or not the timing of these two things overlapped precisely on this day is a matter of historical inference rather than direct scriptural record. But the contrast itself is real and worth holding. Two completely different visions of what a king looks like. Two completely different answers to the question of how the world gets saved. Breathe. The people shouting Hosanna had lived their entire lives under Roman occupation. They had grown up in a world where power meant soldiers and swords and the ability to crush resistance. And now they were shouting for a different kind of king, though most of them did not yet understand what kind of king he actually was. They wanted liberation. They wanted Rome gone. They wanted the kingdom of David restored. What they were being offered was something they could not yet see clearly. Jesus came over the crest of the Mount of Olives, and Jerusalem spread out before him. The temple complex in the center of the city, gleaming white stone in the morning sun, was, by all ancient accounts, one of the most visually extraordinary structures in the world at that time. Ancient writers describe it in terms that leave no doubt about its impact. It caught the light in a way that could be seen from miles away. On a clear morning approaching from the east, it would have filled the view. Jesus looked at the city, and he wept. Not quiet, private tears. The Gospel of Luke uses a word that describes open, audible weeping. He wept over Jerusalem. And he said, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes." He could see what they could not. He could see a city being offered something extraordinary in this moment, and that would, in the decades ahead, turn away from it in ways that would bring tremendous suffering. Luke records that he spoke of days coming upon the city that would bring devastation, words that many scholars connect to the Roman siege and destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, which we would say as 70 years after the birth of Christ. And he wept, not for himself, not because of what the week ahead held for him. He wept for them, for the city, for the people filling those streets who were waving palm branches and shouting for a king and did not yet understand the depth of what was being offered to them in this moment. He loved them anyway. He rode into the city through the eastern gate. The crowd pressed around him. The noise was extraordinary. The Pharisees, making their way through the crowd toward him, said, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Tell them to stop." He said to them, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." He entered the temple courts. He looked around at everything there. And then, because it was already late in the day, he went back out of the city, back to Bethany, back to the house, back to the people who knew him. The crowd that had shouted Hosanna dispersed into the crowded streets. The palm branches remained on the road. The moment had passed, or so it seemed. But the religious leaders had seen everything. They had heard the titles the crowd was using. Son of David, the one who comes in the name of the Lord. These were not neutral phrases. These were claims. And the men who ran the temple had been watching, and now they had seen enough. That night, in rooms Jesus was not in, decisions began to be made. But he was not in those rooms. He was in Bethany, resting. Let yourself rest too. The palms have been laid down. The crowd has gone home. The city is full of pilgrims who came for Passover and found something unexpected on the road into town. Most of them will go to sleep tonight, not fully understanding what they witnessed. A man on a donkey. A crowd singing old words from old scriptures. A moment that felt like something without yet knowing what. But the one on the donkey knew, and he went home and rested. You are known tonight too, more completely than you realize. Sleep now. The week is only beginning. Chapter 3. Monday. The temple turned upside down. He came back into Jerusalem the next morning. The Passover crowds were still filling the city, the streets still busy, the temple courts still packed with pilgrims who had come from every direction to fulfill the requirements of the feast. The sellers were already at their tables in the outer courts. The money changers had their coins spread before them. The animals were in their pens. The business of Passover was fully underway, and Jesus walked in and overturned the tables. But before we get to that moment, we need to understand something that most people miss when they read this story. Because what Jesus did on that Monday morning was not an impulsive act of anger. It was a deliberate challenge to an entire system. And to understand why, we need to understand what that system had become. The temple complex that stood in Jerusalem in the 1st century was one of the most architecturally ambitious structures in the ancient world. Ancient writers describe it in terms that make clear it dominated the city and could be seen from miles away. The outer courts of the complex were open to a much broader group of people than the inner sanctuary. At the very center was the place accessible only to priests. Around it were courts with increasingly broad access. Jewish men could enter certain areas. Jewish women could enter others. And then, on the outermost level, was the area that many scholars refer to as the Court of the Gentiles. This outer court was the only part of the entire complex where non-Jewish people were permitted to enter. It was the only place in the world's most significant religious site where a person who was not born into the covenant community could come and stand in the presence of the God of Israel. For devout Gentiles, for people who had heard of the God of Israel and wanted to approach him, this outer court was the only space available to them, and it had been turned into a marketplace. The sellers of animals were there. Pigeons and doves and lambs, all the creatures needed for the various offerings, available for purchase so that pilgrims who had traveled long distances did not have to bring their own animals. The money changers were there because the temple tax had to be paid in a specific currency, which meant pilgrims arriving with other coins had to exchange them first. A practical service, provided for a fee. There was a logic to it. But Jesus looked at it and said it had to stop. He entered the outer court and drove out the sellers and buyers. He overturned the tables of the money changers. He poured out their coins. He overturned the seats of those who sold doves. He would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the courts. And then he said something that cuts to the heart of what this was really about. He brought together two passages of Scripture, placing them side by side to build an argument that everyone in that courtyard would have understood. From the prophet Isaiah, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." And from the prophet Jeremiah, "But you have made it a den of robbers, all peoples." The outer court was supposed to be the place where all peoples could come, where the person from the edges of the known world who had no Jewish ancestry and no claim on the covenant could still come and stand before the God who made everything. That was its design. That was its purpose. And the space intended for those people had been filled with commerce. The noise and smell of a livestock market occupied the ground where prayer was supposed to be possible. The one group with no other option had been effectively crowded out of the only space they were permitted to use. This is why he cleared it. Not because commerce was inherently wrong, not because the practical needs of pilgrims did not matter, but because the most vulnerable people in the entire system, the ones with the least access to begin with, had lost even that. He made room for the ones who had no room. Breathe. And then, almost as an aside in Matthew's account, something happened that I think is one of the quietest and most beautiful moments in the entire Holy Week narrative. After he had cleared the outer court, the blind and the lame came to him there, and he healed them, in the space he had just made. The people who were always at the margins, the people who were not permitted in the inner courts because physical impairment excluded them under the purity standards of the time, those people came to him in the space that had just been cleared, and he healed them. The chief priests and scribes saw all of it. They saw the tables overturned and the healing and the children in the courts shouting Hosanna to the Son of David. And they were indignant. They came to Jesus and said, "Do you hear what these are saying?" He said, "Have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise?" He quoted Psalm 8 back at them. The children were not being disruptive. They were, in his words, fulfilling Scripture. The chief priests and scribes left, but they did not go far, and they did not forget. Now there is a detail in this story that is easy to overlook, but that changes how we understand Monday entirely. Jesus had been in the temple the evening before. The Gospels of Mark and Luke both record that on Palm Sunday, after riding into the city, he entered the temple courts and looked around at everything there. And then, because it was already late, he left and returned to Bethany. He saw the marketplace on Sunday. He came back on Monday and cleared it. This means what happened on Monday was not a reaction. It was not a moment of passion that overcame him when he walked in and was surprised by what he found. He had seen it. He had left. He had spent the night in Bethany. He had returned in the morning with intention. That distinction matters. It tells us this was not anger without thought. It was not a loss of control. It was a person who saw something wrong, took time, and returned the next day to address it in the clearest possible terms. There is a kind of courage in that kind of deliberate confrontation that is different from impulse. Impulse acts before it thinks. What Jesus did on Monday required sleeping on it, waking up, and choosing to go back. And he went back knowing that going back would accelerate everything. He made room for the ones who had been crowded out. He healed in the space he had cleared. He heard the voices the powerful wanted silenced. And then he went back to Bethany, back to rest. Tonight, in the outer court where the coins still lay on the stones and the space was finally clear, there is a quiet that feels like something restored. Something that was supposed to be there all along, returned to its proper form. Rest now. You do not need to overturn anything before you sleep. There is time for that. Tonight just notice that there is a God who comes into crowded spaces and makes room, who hears the voices others want silenced, who heals in the spaces that have just been cleared, who goes home in the evening and rests and comes back in the morning ready to do it again. He is not finished. He never is. Sleep well. Tomorrow is Tuesday, and Tuesday is the longest day of the week. Chapter 4. Tuesday, the Day of Questions. If you had been in Jerusalem on this particular Tuesday morning and made your way to the temple courts, you would have found what looked, on the surface, like a public debate. A teacher surrounded by crowds. Religious leaders approaching one by one with carefully prepared questions. An audience listening to every word. The kind of scene not unusual in a city full of Passover pilgrims, when teachers gathered in the temple courts and the air was thick with people wrestling with the great questions of the faith. But this was not a debate. This was an interrogation. And everyone in that courtyard knew it. Tuesday of Holy Week is the longest and most intellectually intense day in the entire gospel narrative. More of Jesus' recorded words come from this single day than from almost any other period in his ministry. He taught. He was challenged. He responded. He challenged back. He answered questions designed to trap him. He asked a question no one could answer. He told stories that cut so deep the people they were aimed at understood immediately they were about them. And then, at the end of the day, he sat on the Mount of Olives and spoke to his disciples about the end of the age. All of this in a single Tuesday. The religious establishment came in waves. The first group was the chief priests and elders, with a question about authority. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? They meant the clearing of the temple. They meant the healings. They meant the whole disruptive presence he had brought into their carefully ordered world. If he named a divine source, they would call it blasphemy. If he named a human one, they could dismiss him. He answered their question with a question. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from man? And they were stuck. If they said from heaven, he would ask why they had not believed John. If they said from man, the crowd, which held John as a prophet, would turn against them. They said they did not know. And he said, then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. He had not evaded the question. He had revealed the nature of the questioners. They were not asking because they wanted truth. They were asking because they wanted leverage. And he had shown the crowd exactly what was happening, without a single direct accusation. Then came the parables. He told the story of a landowner who planted a vineyard and leased it to tenants. When the landowner sent servants to collect the fruit at harvest time, the tenants beat them and killed them. Finally, the landowner sent his own son, thinking they would respect him. The tenants saw the son coming and said, "This is the heir. Let us kill him and take his inheritance." They threw him out and killed him. Jesus asked the chief priests and elders what the owner of the vineyard would do to those tenants. They answered without thinking, "He will bring those wretches to a miserable end and lease the vineyard to others." They had pronounced their own judgment before they realized what they were doing. He said, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." They understood the parable was about them. They wanted to arrest him immediately, but they feared the crowd, which considered him a prophet. Breathe. The second wave came with a different strategy. The Pharisees sent their disciples along with members of a group called the Herodians. These two groups had nothing in common politically and would not ordinarily have been seen together. The only thing that united them on this Tuesday was the shared desire to neutralize this teacher from Galilee. They came with what they believed was a perfect trap. "Teacher, we know you are true and teach the way of God faithfully and do not care about anyone's opinion. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" If he said yes, he would lose the crowd that resented Roman taxation. If he said no, he could be reported to the Romans as an insurrectionist, giving the authorities legal grounds to arrest him immediately. He said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." Someone produced a denarius. He held it up. "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." He said, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." They marveled and left him. What he had done was not a clever dodge. It was a profound reorientation. Yes, the coin bears Caesar's image. Give Caesar what bears his image. But the deeper question, drawn from the very beginning of Genesis, is this: what bears God's image? The answer, for anyone who knew their scripture, was immediate. Human beings are made in the image of God. Render to God what bears his image. Render yourself. The third wave came from the Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem, who accepted only the first 5 books of Moses as scripture and who did not believe in resurrection from the dead. They came with a question designed to make resurrection look absurd. A woman married 7 brothers in succession, each dying without children. In the resurrection, whose wife would she be? He said to them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. In the resurrection, people will not be married as they are now. And as for resurrection itself, have you not read what God said at the burning bush? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Not I was. I am. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living." The crowd was astonished. Then a scribe came forward, and unlike the others, he appeared to be asking genuinely, "Which commandment is the most important of all?" This was a question that Jewish scholars had wrestled with for generations. The Torah contains 613 commandments. Rabbis had spent centuries trying to identify the principle that unified them all. The scribe was not laying a trap. He wanted to know. Jesus answered without hesitation, "The most important is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." The scribe said, "You are right, teacher. To love God with all the heart and understanding and strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." And Jesus said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." Breathe. Not far from the kingdom of God. Let that phrase stay with you for a moment. A man who had asked an honest question, who had received the answer and recognized its truth, who had the intellectual honesty to agree publicly in a crowd that was mostly hostile to the man he was agreeing with. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You are not far. Not there yet, but not far." After that, no one dared ask him any more questions. And Jesus turned to the crowd and began to speak on his own terms. He spoke about teachers of the law who loved the places of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues. He spoke about religion that performs itself publicly while exploiting the vulnerable privately. And then he sat down near the offering box and watched people bring their contributions. Many wealthy people put in large amounts, and a widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, worth a fraction of a penny. He called his disciples over. "Truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing. for they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Everything she had. On a day full of elaborate arguments and theological debates and public confrontations between powerful men, he stopped and pointed to a widow with 2 coins. And he said she had given more than all of them. He left the temple. His disciples pointed out the buildings of the complex, the scale of the stones, the beauty of the construction. He said, "You see all these? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." They walked out of the city and up the Mount of Olives. And there, on the hillside with Jerusalem spread out below them in the afternoon light, 4 disciples came to him privately. Peter and James and John and Andrew. They asked him 2 questions. "When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" What followed is known as the Olivet Discourse. He spoke about wars and the suffering that would come, about persecution and endurance, about a time unlike anything before it, about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He wove together things that were near and things that were far, and the full interpretation of what he said has occupied careful readers for 2,000 years. But in the middle of all of it, he said something that cuts through every layer of interpretation and reaches across the centuries. "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." And then this, "Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming." Stay awake. Be ready. Be found faithful when the moment comes. He said it in different forms throughout this long teaching on the hillside. The servant found faithful when the master returns. The 10 waiting with their lamps, 5 of whom kept oil in reserve for the long wait. The servants who were given resources and trusted to use them well while the master was away. Stay awake. Stay ready. And then the teaching was over. He came down from the hillside with his disciples and walked back toward Bethany in the lengthening shadows of a Tuesday that had contained more than most weeks. Breathe. Tuesday is over. You have walked through a day that would have exhausted most people before noon. A day of confrontation from every direction. Met without flinching, without losing composure, without becoming something other than what he was. And at the end of it, he walked back over the Mount of Olives in the evening light and went to a house in Bethany and rested. There is something about that rhythm worth carrying into sleep tonight. The full presence in the hard moments, and the deliberate return to rest when the hard moments were done. He did not stay in Jerusalem reviewing the day. He went home. You are allowed to do both. To be fully present in what your life requires of you, and to come home at the end of the day and rest. He did. Sleep now. Wednesday brings a silence that is unlike anything else in this story. And the silence has things to say. Chapter 5. Wednesday, the silence and the betrayal. There is a Wednesday in Holy Week. Most people know this in theory, but tend to skip past it on the way to Thursday, to the upper room and the Last Supper and what follows. Wednesday feels like a corridor between the intensity of Tuesday and the weight of what is coming. A day without a headline event. A day the gospel writers move through quickly, or in some accounts do not address at all. But Wednesday is not empty. Wednesday is a silence. And silences in Scripture are rarely accidental. Before we sit with what this silence might contain, let us establish what we know. On Wednesday of Holy Week, there is no recorded public ministry, no teaching in the temple courts, no confrontations with religious authorities, no crowds pressing around him. Every other day of this week has specific events, specific words, specific encounters. Wednesday has almost none of that. What we do know is this. Somewhere in Jerusalem, on Wednesday, Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and offered to hand Jesus over to them. "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" They counted out 30 pieces of silver. From that moment, Matthew tells us Judas was looking for an opportunity to betray him. 30 pieces of silver. It is one of those details that has become so familiar through centuries of retelling that it has almost lost its weight. In the context of the first century, 30 shekels is the amount specified in the book of Exodus as compensation for a slave. It communicated something about how much the chief priests valued the man they wanted. Not very much. And Judas took it. Breathe. We need to sit with Judas for a moment. Not to excuse what he did, but because he deserves to be understood as a human being rather than simply a symbol, and because attempting to understand him helps us understand something about the nature of this week. Judas was not an outsider. He was one of the 12. He had been with Jesus from the beginning of the Galilean ministry. He had heard every teaching. He had watched every healing. He had been trusted with the group's finances. He had sat at table with Jesus night after night over 3 years of traveling together. Whatever led him to that room on Wednesday was not the decision of a stranger. It was the decision of someone who knew Jesus as well as almost anyone alive. What went wrong? Scholars and theologians have debated this for 2,000 years, and no single answer satisfies everyone. Some have pointed to evidence the Gospel of John provides about his character and his relationship with money. Others have suggested that Judas may have been a man who believed genuinely in the coming kingdom, but had grown increasingly frustrated that Jesus kept refusing to act with political or military force. It is possible, some have argued, that he may have thought engineering a confrontation between Jesus and the authorities would force things into a crisis that Jesus would then resolve by finally revealing his power in an unmistakable way. If something like that was his thinking, he was about to discover how profoundly he had misread everything. But on Wednesday, none of that has happened yet. On Wednesday, Judas has made his decision and is waiting for the right moment. The other 11 do not know. They are in Bethany, resting, perhaps going over what had happened during the intensity of the past 3 days. Not knowing that in a room somewhere in Jerusalem, 30 coins have just been counted out. And Jesus. What did Jesus do on Wednesday? The Gospels do not tell us. This is the silence. Breathe. Sit with that for a moment. Because there is something unusual about a day in the Gospel narrative where we simply do not know what happened. Every other day of this week is documented with specific events and words and encounters. Wednesday is a blank, and blanks in Scripture have always invited reflection. Some scholars suggest he may have spent the day in Bethany, resting completely, that the intensity of Sunday through Tuesday had been physically and emotionally demanding in ways that required withdrawal and preparation for what was coming. Others have suggested he may have spent time in prayer on the hillside in the way he often withdrew before the great moments of his ministry. Before choosing the 12 disciples, he had prayed through the entire night. The Mount of Olives was close. The olive groves would have been quiet on a Wednesday morning. We do not know. But here is what I believe Wednesday is doing in the shape of the story. Holy Week is not structured like a document with a thesis and supporting arguments. It is structured like a life, with its moments of loud public confrontation and its moments of private interior quiet. And if you look at the rhythm of the week, the escalating tension from Sunday through Tuesday, and then Wednesday's silence, and then the intensity of Thursday evening, and everything that follows, the silence on Wednesday is doing something important. It is breathing. It is the inhale before the longest exhale. It is the stillness before the storm that will change everything. And there is a kind of wisdom in recognizing that even the most significant week in human history had a Wednesday. Even the story that contains the Last Supper and Gethsemane and the cross and the empty tomb had a day that was, from the outside, unremarkable. Your life has Wednesdays too. Days that feel like nothing is happening. Days that seem like a corridor between the meaningful moments. Days when the significant things are behind you and the next significant thing has not yet arrived and you are simply in the middle, in the ordinary, in the silence. Wednesday is not nothing. Wednesday may be where some of the most important things happen. The things that have no audience, the things that leave no record, the things that are between you and God alone. He was present in that silence too. Breathe. There is a detail from earlier in the week that belongs here, because it may have been part of the seed from which the betrayal grew. A few days before Palm Sunday, while Jesus was still in Bethany, something had happened at a dinner in the home of a man named Simon the leper. A woman came in carrying an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, a perfume made from pure nard, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Some of those present were indignant. "Why this waste?" they said. "This ointment could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." The Gospel of John, writing from a slightly different vantage point, identifies Judas as the one who raised this objection most pointedly. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial." For burial. He said it plainly, and Judas heard it. What was moving inside Judas between that dinner and Wednesday, the text does not tell us directly, and it would be wrong to claim more certainty than the Scripture gives us. What we know is that sometime in the days between that evening and Wednesday, something became a decision. And on Wednesday, 30 pieces of silver were counted out. The transaction was complete, and Jesus, wherever he spent that quiet Wednesday, knew. The Gospel of John makes clear throughout its account that Jesus was not surprised by what Judas did. He had known for some time what was coming. He had continued to include Judas, to walk with him, to eat with him, to carry the knowledge of what was ahead without turning Judas away from the table. That is almost impossible to fully comprehend. To know that someone you have chosen, someone you have loved and taught and traveled with for years, is moving toward handing you over to the people who want to kill you, and to continue to offer him the table, to let him stay. Breathe. The silence of Wednesday contains that too. It contains the particular loneliness of knowing something that no one around you knows. The particular patience of a love that does not stop being love even when it is being traded away. He did not confront Judas publicly on Wednesday. He did not chase him down. He let the silence be silence. And somewhere in that silence, perhaps on a hillside with ancient olive trees and the distant sound of a city preparing for Passover, he may have prayed. We do not know what he prayed, but we know that he prayed the way he always prayed, with honesty, with surrender. With the intimacy of someone talking to a father who already knows everything and yet still wants to hear it said. The silence of Wednesday was not empty. It was full of things that had no words. And sometimes the things that have no words are the most important things of all. Let tonight be a Wednesday for you, if it needs to be. Let it be the night where nothing dramatic happens, where no great resolution is reached, where the silence is allowed to simply be silence, where you do not need to produce anything or understand anything or fix anything, where you are simply present in the quiet, the way he was present in the quiet, carrying what you carry, knowing what you know, trusting what you trust. The window is still worth opening in the morning, but tonight let it be closed. Let the room be still. Let the silence hold you the way it may have held him. Sleep now. Thursday is coming, and Thursday will ask everything of us. Chapter 6. Thursday morning. The preparation. Thursday arrived, the way significant days often arrive. Without announcement. Without the sky changing color or the air carrying any particular warning. Just the ordinary beginning of a morning in Bethany, the light coming up over the hills to the east, the sound of the city in the distance, already stirring with the preparations of the most important evening of the Jewish year. Because tonight was the Passover, not the week of Passover in the general sense, which had already begun. Tonight was the specific night when every Jewish family in Jerusalem and throughout the known world would gather around a table, eat the prescribed meal, drink the prescribed cups of wine, recite the prescribed words, and remember the night that had defined them as a people. The night in Egypt, centuries before, when the angel of death had passed over the homes marked with the blood of a lamb. The night of their liberation. The night that had made them who they were. The lamb had to be brought to the temple that afternoon. The unleavened bread had to be prepared. The bitter herbs. Everything had to be ready before sundown when the Passover meal would begin. And Jesus turned to two of his disciples. He turned to Peter and John. He said to them, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it." They asked the natural question, "Where?" And here is where the instructions become remarkable. He said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters and tell the master of the house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there." A man carrying a jar of water. In Jerusalem, in the time of Jesus, carrying water was almost exclusively the work of women. Water jars were carried on the head or hip throughout the ancient Near East, and this was understood as women's work. A man carrying a water jar in the streets of Jerusalem during the busyness of Passover preparation would have stood out in the crowd in a way that made him easy to identify. Jesus was giving Peter and John a precise and unusual signal. Look for the one thing that does not fit the expected pattern. When you see him, follow him. They went. They entered the city, joining the thousands of other pilgrims and residents, moving through Jerusalem with their own preparations. The city on this Thursday would have been extraordinary to the senses. Thousands of Passover lambs were being brought to the temple for the prescribed ritual. Ancient sources describe the scale of this as requiring the priests to work in long shifts throughout the afternoon. The smoke of the offerings rose throughout the day. The smell of it reached every part of the city. This was Jerusalem at the height of its most sacred and most intense day of the year. And Peter and John walked through all of it looking for a man carrying a water jar. They found him. He led them to a house. They went inside and spoke to the owner. The master of the house heard the words, "The teacher says, where is the guest room?" And he led them upstairs. The upper room. In Jerusalem, houses built into the slopes of the city's hills often had a large room on the upper level, sometimes accessible by an exterior staircase, used for hosting guests or for community gatherings. The room Peter and John were shown was large and furnished and ready. Someone had prepared this room for this purpose. Scholars have suggested various possibilities for who this person might have been, though the text does not tell us directly. The owner is unnamed. The house is unnamed. What we know for certain is only this. When Jesus needed a room, there was a room. Breathe. There is something in that worth pausing on. The borrowed donkey on Sunday. The room on Thursday. Throughout this week, what Jesus needed was provided through ordinary people making ordinary things available. The owner of the donkey told nothing more than that the Lord had need of it. The owner of the upper room, agreeing when asked. Neither of them appears in the story again. Neither is named. They simply made what they had available and stepped back. The most important week in human history was supported, in its practical details, by unnamed people who said yes when asked. Peter and John set about the work of preparation. The Passover meal had specific requirements that went back to the instructions given in the book of Exodus. The lamb had to be taken to the temple and slaughtered according to the prescribed ritual. The unleavened bread, the matzah, prepared without yeast. The bitter herbs, representing the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. The charazet, a mixture of fruit and nuts and wine representing the mortar the Israelite slaves had used in building. and the 4 cups of wine to be drunk at specific points in the meal, each tied to one of the 4 promises God had made to Israel in Exodus. I will bring you out. I will deliver you. I will redeem you. I will take you as my people. 4 cups. 4 promises. And this meal was not merely a commemoration. It was by design a participation. Every year, Jewish families did not simply remember the Exodus from a historical distance. The Passover Haggadah, the telling, required the head of the household to say, in every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he personally left Egypt. This was living memory. This was present tense. Peter and John prepared it all. They went to the temple with the lamb. They received back the portions of the animal that were theirs to take. They carried everything back to the upper room. They laid the table. They prepared the bread and set out the cups. And in the late afternoon, as the sun began to lower toward the western hills and Jerusalem moved toward the sacred threshold of nightfall, Jesus arrived with the other 10 disciples. He walked up the stairs into the upper room. He looked at what had been prepared. He looked at the faces of the 12 men he had spent 3 years with, the fisherman from Galilee, the tax collector, the zealot, the brothers, the ones who had understood and the ones who had not, and the ones who had understood some things and missed others entirely. He looked at them and said, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I have earnestly desired. The Greek construction here expresses intensity. He had longed for this evening with an urgency that matched the significance of what was about to happen within it and because of it. He knew what this meal would contain. He knew what the night ahead would bring. And he had earnestly desired to be here, in this room, at this table, with these people, before all of it began. Rest here for a moment. Let the room settle around you. Jerusalem on the Thursday of Passover week. The smell of the lamb and the bread and the wine. The oil lamps casting their light on 13 faces. The sound of the city outside, full of other families doing exactly what they were doing, eating this same meal, reciting these same words, honoring this same night. And him, looking at them with something that the gospel accounts, taken together, suggest was a love so complete and so aware of what was about to be asked of it, that adequate language for it is difficult to find. He had earnestly desired this evening, and the evening was just beginning. Breathe. Let your body settle deeper. The preparation is complete. The room is ready. The table is set. And the most important meal in human history is about to begin. You do not need to prepare anything tonight. Everything has already been made ready. Rest now, and let us move into the evening together. Chapter 7. Thursday evening, the Last Supper. The meal began, as it always began, with the first cup of wine, the cup of sanctification, lifted and blessed, declaring the holiness of this night above all other nights of the year. The familiar words, the familiar ritual. 13 men in an upper room in Jerusalem, doing what Jewish families had done on this night for over 1,000 years. And yet nothing about this evening was ordinary, because the man lifting the cup knew what the night would contain. He knew that before the sun rose on Friday morning, one of the 12 men in this room would have handed him over to armed soldiers. He knew that before this same night was over, the one who called himself the Rock would deny 3 times that he had ever known him. He knew that by the time the Passover lamb was being offered at the temple on Friday afternoon, he would be dying on a Roman cross outside the city walls. He knew all of this, and he lifted the cup and gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." He was saying goodbye to something, not dramatically, not with the performance of grief, but with the quiet directness of a man who knows exactly where he is in the story and wants the people he loves to understand it too, even if they cannot yet, they could not yet. He rose from the table. What happened next was so contrary to everything the disciples understood about how the world was ordered that John devotes more attention to it than to almost anything else in his account of the evening. Jesus took off his outer robe. He wrapped a towel around his waist. He poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the feet of his disciples. To understand what this meant, we need to understand the world it happened in. Foot washing in first-century Judea was not a metaphor. It was a practical necessity. The roads of Jerusalem were unpaved stone, and during Passover week they were crowded with animals and the waste that comes with them. People wore open sandals. By the time you arrived anywhere, your feet were genuinely, literally, in need of attention before you reclined at a table with others. But foot washing was not done by the master of the house. It was not done by the teacher. It was done by the lowest servant available. In households that had servants at various levels, foot washing was assigned to the one who ranked below all the others. Some rabbinic texts from this period suggest that a disciple should not wash his teacher's feet because the relationship of disciple to teacher was considered too dignified for that particular task. Even a disciple was not required to perform this service for his rabbi. Jesus was the teacher. He was the one they called Rabbi and Lord. He was the one whose sandals John the Baptist had said he was not worthy to untie. And he was on his knees with a basin of water washing the road dust off the feet of fishermen. He came to Peter. Peter's response is entirely consistent with everything we know about him. Lord, do you wash my feet? The emphasis in the Greek is on the contrast between you and my feet. You, of all people, my feet, of all things. Jesus said, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus said, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." And Peter, who never did anything by halves, reversed course completely. "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus washed all their feet, including the feet of Judas. Breathe. He washed the feet of the man who had already counted out 30 pieces of silver for the price of him. He knelt in front of Judas Iscariot with the basin and the towel and washed the road dust off his feet. And then he put his robe back on and returned to his place at the table and said, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I, then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you." He was not merely offering a lesson in humility. He was redefining the entire structure of how power and honor and service were understood. In a world where status determined every interaction you had and every space you were permitted to occupy, he took the position of the lowest servant in the room and said, "This is what leadership looks like. This is what I look like. And you are to look like this too." The meal continued. And then, in the middle of it, he said something that silenced the room. "Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another. John tells us they were genuinely uncertain, questioning each other about which of them it could be. Peter gestured to John, who was reclining next to Jesus, to ask who it was. John leaned close and asked quietly, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus said, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." He took a piece of bread, he dipped it, and he gave it to Judas Iscariot. In the culture of the first century, the act of dipping bread and handing it to someone at the table was understood as a gesture of honor and friendship. It was what a host did for a valued guest. Even here, at the moment of naming the betrayal, he was extending friendship. He said to Judas, quietly, "What you are going to do quickly." The others at the table did not fully understand what had passed between them. Some thought Jesus was telling Judas, who kept the money, to go and buy what they needed for the feast, or perhaps to give something to the poor. Judas left. The Gospel of John records 4 words after his departure that carry more weight than almost any other sentence in any literature. And it was night. It was night. Breathe. Let those words be what they are for a moment. Judas walked out of the upper room and down the stairs and into the dark streets of Jerusalem. And inside, 11 men sat with the one who had just watched a friend walk away into the night carrying the price of his life. And Jesus began to speak. What followed is recorded in John chapters 13 through 17, and it is the longest uninterrupted teaching Jesus gave in the entire gospel narrative. He spoke for a considerable time in this upper room on this night to these 11 men who still did not fully understand what was happening. And what he said was not doctrine or argument or formal instruction. It was something closer to a farewell conversation between someone who loves deeply and people who are about to lose something they do not yet know they are losing. He said, "Little children, yet a little while I am with you." Little children. It is an extraordinarily tender address. He had called them disciples and friends and servants. But in this moment, on this night, he called them little children. He said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Just as I have loved you." Not love one another when it is easy. Not love one another according to what they deserve. Love one another the way I have loved you. With basin and towel. With a seat at the table even for the one who just walked out into the night. Peter asked where he was going. Jesus said Peter could not follow now, but would follow later. Peter said he would lay down his life for him. And Jesus said, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Peter did not believe it. Jesus said, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. Let not your hearts be troubled." He said it on the night of his betrayal. He said it in the room that Judas had just left. He said it to men who were confused and afraid and who did not yet understand what was happening around them. "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Many rooms. A place prepared. I will come again. He was speaking about the future as though it were already secured, as though what was about to happen in the next 12 hours was not an obstacle to the promise, but the very means by which the promise would be fulfilled. Thomas said, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" Jesus said, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us." Jesus said, "Have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." He continued. He spoke about the Holy Spirit, whom he called the Helper, the Advocate, the one who would come after he was gone, and would teach them all things, and bring to their remembrance everything he had said to them. He said, "I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you." And then he said this, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." Peace. Not the peace that comes from the absence of difficulty. Not the peace enforced by empire at the point of a sword. Something different. Something that could exist inside a night like this one, inside the full knowledge of what the next few hours would contain and still be called peace. His peace. Breathe. Let the room settle around you here. Let the oil lamps burn low and the night deepen outside the windows, and the city grow quiet around 13 men sitting together for the last time before everything changed. He said, "I am the vine. You are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me you can do nothing. He told them the world would hate them, and that they would have sorrow. But their sorrow would turn into joy. And then he said, "In the world you will have tribulation. But take heart, I have overcome the world." He said it before the cross, before the resurrection, before any of it had happened in the visible sense. He said it as something already true in a dimension his disciples could not yet see. And then he prayed. John chapter 17 is sometimes called the high priestly prayer, and it is one of the most intimate passages in all of Scripture. Because in this prayer, we are not reading a theological treatise or a formal declaration. We are, in the most remarkable way, overhearing a conversation between the Son and the Father, spoken aloud in a room with 11 witnesses on the last night before everything changed. He lifted his eyes toward heaven and said, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you." He prayed for himself first, not out of selfishness, but out of the understanding that what was about to happen to him was the means by which everything else would be accomplished. Then he prayed for his disciples. "Holy Father, keep them in your name, which you have given me, that they may be one, even as we are one. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one, that they may be one." He prayed for their unity on the night he was betrayed, when one had already walked out and the others would scatter before morning. He prayed that they would be one. Breathe. Let that land for a moment before we continue. He was praying for people who were about to fail him completely, people who would flee and deny and hide, and he was asking the Father to keep them, to hold them together, not after they had proven themselves worthy of it. Right now, tonight, in the room where the betrayal had just begun, he prayed for them anyway. And then he prayed for everyone who would come after, everyone who would believe because of their testimony, everyone who would hear the message and trust the messenger, everyone throughout history who would sit in a room or a hospital or a quiet house late at night and believe. He prayed for you. "I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us." Breathe deeply. He prayed for you in the upper room in Jerusalem on the night of the Last Supper. Before you were born, before your parents were born, before the country you live in existed, before the language you speak had the form it has now. On a Thursday night in Jerusalem, he lifted his eyes toward heaven and prayed for the people who would one day believe because of what was about to happen. You were in that prayer. He finished praying. He stood. He said to the 11, "Rise, let us go from here." They sang a hymn, the Hallel Psalms, sung traditionally at the end of the Passover meal. Voices in an upper room singing ancient songs about the steadfast love of the Lord that endures forever. About the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone. About the day the Lord has made. They came down from the upper room, down the stairs, out into the dark streets of Jerusalem, through the city gate, across the Kidron Valley, up the other side toward the Mount of Olives, toward the garden. The night had grown late. The streets they walked through were nearly empty, the Passover meals concluded in house after house, the lamps burning low. The valley below them was dark and quiet. He walked ahead of them, into the dark, toward a garden he had been to many times before. Breathe. Let the upper room hold you for a moment before we follow him into the garden. You have been in the room where he washed feet and broke bread and said, "Let not your hearts be troubled," where he prayed for the people who would believe through the testimony of those 11 men, where he sang the psalms of praise before walking toward the hardest thing imaginable. He sang before Gethsemane. He praised before the suffering. He said, "Peace before the chaos." Let that be what you carry into sleep tonight. Not the garden yet, just the room. just the bread and the cup and the prayer and the voice saying, "I will not leave you as orphans." Many rooms. A place prepared. I will come again. Your heart does not need to be troubled tonight. He has already seen to that. Rest now. The night is in his hands. And so are you. Chapter 8. Gethsemane. The weight of the cup. They cross the Kidron Valley in the dark. The valley cuts between the eastern wall of Jerusalem and the slopes of the Mount of Olives, and on the night of Passover, with a full moon overhead, the white limestone of the temple walls would have reflected the light in a way that made the whole scene look suspended between this world and something beyond it. The moon was full. This is not a poetic detail added for effect. It is a calendrical fact. Passover falls on the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which by definition is the night of the full moon. The disciples would have had more light than on an ordinary night. They could see where they were walking. They could see the garden ahead of them on the lower slope of the Mount of Olives, a place he had come to many times before on previous visits to Jerusalem. The garden was called Gethsemane. The name in Aramaic means oil press. It was most likely a working olive grove whose owner had given Jesus and his disciples permission to use it as a place of rest and withdrawal. Olive trees in this region can live for a very long time, and it is worth noting carefully that some of the ancient trees still standing on the slopes of the Mount of Olives today are believed by some botanists to be extraordinarily old, though the exact ages of individual trees in this area remain a matter of ongoing study and debate. They entered the garden. Jesus turned to 8 of the disciples and said, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and James and John a little further in. The 3 who had been with him on the mountain of transfiguration, the 3 who had been closest to him through the most significant moments of the ministry. And then something happened that the gospel writers describe with a care and a specificity that tells us they understood they were recording something important. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. The Greek words used here are striking. The first describes a profound grief, a heaviness that settles in and will not lift. The second describes something closer to distress, a disorientation, the feeling of being in a place so extreme that the ordinary resources of the self are not adequate for it. Mark's Gospel uses an additional word that some translators render as deeply distressed, a word that in other contexts describes a person who has received news so devastating they cannot yet process it. He said to Peter and James and John, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." He went a little further. He fell on his face on the ground, and he prayed, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Breathe. We need to stay here for a moment, because this prayer is the most theologically and emotionally significant moment in the entire Gethsemane account, and it is easy to read past it without fully feeling what is being said. The cup, in the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Scriptures, is a recurring image for something that carries the full weight of consequence. Isaiah wrote about a cup drunk to its dregs. Jeremiah used the image in his own prophetic writings. Most careful readers of Scripture have understood the cup he was asking to be removed as something larger than physical suffering alone, though what he was about to endure physically was severe beyond ordinary description. They have understood it as the full weight of human sin and its consequences, concentrated and carried by a single person who had never contributed to its contents. He was about to take into himself everything that separates human beings from God. And in the garden, in the dark, with the full moon overhead and his closest friends a stone's throw away, the full reality of what that meant came upon him. Not the idea of it, the reality of it, the specific and overwhelming weight of what he was about to carry. And he asked if there was another way, if it be possible. He was not wavering. He was not refusing. He was being honest. He was bringing the full truth of what he was experiencing to his Father, without pretending it was something other than what it was. This is prayer at its most essential, not the performance of composure, not arriving already resolved, but the honest, unguarded bringing of what is actually happening inside you to the one who can receive it. He told the truth about what he was feeling, and then he said, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The nevertheless holds both things at once. The genuine desire for another way, and the genuine surrender to the way that is. It does not cancel the honesty that came before it. It completes it. He went back to Peter and James and John. They were asleep. He said to Peter, "So, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." No anger beyond the quiet question. He understood what weakness felt like from the inside. He was experiencing the limits of human flesh in their most extreme form in this very garden on this very night. He went away again and prayed the same prayer. "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." The language has shifted slightly. The first prayer asked if the cup could pass. The second begins with the acknowledgement that perhaps it cannot. He was moving through something, not from doubt to faith, because faith had never been absent, but from the initial impact of the full weight of what was coming, through honest wrestling, toward a settled surrender that was not resignation but choice. He came back. They were asleep again, their eyes heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. What do you say to someone in a moment like that? There are no words adequate for the particular loneliness of carrying something that no one else in the room can fully share. And so they slept. He went away a third time and prayed the same words. Luke, who was a physician, includes a detail in his account that has drawn careful attention over the centuries. He writes that in his anguish, Jesus prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Scholars note that the Greek construction here could be read as a vivid simile rather than a necessarily literal description, and the interpretation of this phrase has been discussed across many centuries of careful reading. Whether understood literally or as a powerful comparison, what Luke is communicating is clear. The anguish in this garden was not abstract. It was physical in its intensity, pressing itself into the body. Luke also records that an angel appeared from heaven and strengthened him. Not rescue, not a way out. Strength to continue. Sometimes that is what comes. Not the removal of the hard thing, but the strength to walk through it. Breathe. He came back to the disciples for the third time. "Sleep and take your rest later on," he said, with a gentleness that is almost unbearable given everything surrounding it. "See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And even as he was speaking, there was noise at the entrance to the garden. Torch, lanterns, weapons. A crowd sent by the chief priests and elders, armed with swords and clubs, and at the front of them, walking ahead of the soldiers through the olive trees in the moonlight, the man who knew where to find him because he had been coming here with him for years. Judas. He had arranged a sign with the soldiers. "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." He walked directly to Jesus. "Greetings, Rabbi," he said, and he kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Friend. Even now. The soldiers stepped forward and seized Jesus. Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, a man named Malchus. Jesus said, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" He was not captured because he was helpless. He was surrendering because surrender was the choice. He reached out and healed the ear of Malchus. Then all the disciples left him and fled. He was alone now. The soldiers bound his hands and led him out of the garden and back across the Kidron Valley toward the city. The full moon lit the road. He walked it with his hands bound, back toward Jerusalem, back toward the night that had already been decided. He had prayed. He had asked if there was another way. And having asked, he had chosen, not because the cup was anything other than what it was, but because on the other side of it was something that could not be reached any other way. Your will be done. Breathe. Let the garden grow quiet around you. Let the torches disappear down the road toward the city. Let the olive trees stand in the moonlight the way they have always stood, old and patient and rooted in something deeper than the events that occur around them. He prayed in this garden. He was honest about his sorrow. He asked for another way. And then he chose, whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever you have been asking to have removed, whatever prayer you have prayed more than once in the dark while the people around you slept, he knows what that feels like from the inside. Not as a theological idea, as a lived experience, in a garden, on his knees, in the dark. He knows. And he is not asking you to pretend the cup is not heavy. He is only asking you to trust the one who knows what the cup is for. Nevertheless, your will be done. Rest now. The night is still his, and so are you. Chapter 9. Friday. The Trials and the Road to Golgotha. What happened between midnight and 9 in the morning on the Friday of Holy Week was, by almost any legal standard of its time, a procedural catastrophe. 6 separate hearings. 6 different authorities. A verdict decided before the first question was asked. A man moved from room to room in the dark hours of a Passover night while the city slept, and the priests conducting the proceedings were aware that what they were doing could not survive the scrutiny of daylight. They needed it finished before morning. We need to walk through these hours carefully, because the trials of Jesus are not simply a record of injustice. They are a portrait of the way power behaves when it is afraid, and they are the frame around the most consequential death in human history. The soldiers led him first to the house of Annas. Annas was one of the most powerful men in Jerusalem, perhaps the most powerful in the entire Jewish religious establishment, despite not currently holding the title of high priest. He had served as high priest for a period before being removed from the position by the Roman authorities, who held the power of appointment and dismissal. But in the view of many Jewish people, the high priesthood was a lifetime appointment under the law, and Annas retained an authority in practice that exceeded his official title. His son-in-law Caiaphas held the position currently. The leadership of the temple moved through this family. Annas questioned him about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus said, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." It was a direct and reasonable response. Everything he had taught publicly. If there was evidence against him, it was available to anyone who had been paying attention. One of the officers standing nearby struck him across the face. "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus said, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas. The Sanhedrin, the ruling council, had been assembled at the house of Caiaphas. This was the second hearing, and it was here that the proceedings reached their decisive moment. The council was looking for testimony against Jesus that would justify a death sentence. Various witnesses came forward. Their testimonies did not agree with one another, which under Jewish law rendered them invalid. The proceedings were producing nothing usable. Finally, Caiaphas stood up and addressed Jesus directly. "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" Jesus said nothing. The silence must have been extraordinary. In a room full of officials who had assembled in the middle of the night with the express purpose of ending his life, he stood and offered nothing. Caiaphas said, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Under Jewish law, if a person was placed under oath by the living God in a formal proceeding, silence was not a legally available response. Jesus said, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." He answered clearly and without qualification. And he answered with words drawn from two places in the Hebrew Scriptures. The right hand of power from Psalm 110, and coming on the clouds of heaven from the prophet Daniel, describing the figure who comes before the Ancient of Days and receives an everlasting kingdom. He was not simply claiming to be the Messiah in a political sense. He was claiming to be the figure of Daniel's vision. Caiaphas tore his robes, the traditional gesture on hearing blasphemy. "He has uttered blasphemy," he said. "What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." And some of them began to spit in his face, to strike him, to mock him. He received it. Breathe. While this was happening inside the house of Caiaphas, something was unfolding in the courtyard outside. Peter had followed at a distance when the soldiers led Jesus from the garden. He had managed to get inside the courtyard of the high priest's house. He stood there warming himself at a charcoal fire with the servants and officers, waiting in the way people wait when they do not know what else to do. A servant girl looked at him in the firelight. "You also were with Jesus the Galilean," she said. He denied it in front of everyone. Another servant girl saw him near the gateway and said to those standing nearby, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again, with an oath. A little later, some bystanders said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Galileans spoke with a distinctive regional accent that was recognizable to people from Jerusalem. Peter invoked a curse on himself and swore, "I do not know the man." Immediately the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered what Jesus had said only hours before in the upper room. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." He went outside and wept bitterly. When morning came, the chief priests and elders held a brief formal session to ratify the decision made during the night. They bound Jesus and led him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Because they could not execute anyone, the power of capital punishment belonged to Rome. If they wanted Jesus dead by the method they had chosen, they needed the governor's cooperation. Pilate came out to meet them, because they would not enter his residence. Entering a Gentile building during Passover would make them ritually impure. They had spent the night arranging the trial of an innocent man, and they were concerned about a doorframe. Pilate looked at the man they had brought. "What accusation do you bring against this man?" The religious leaders deflected, saying if he were not doing evil, they would not have brought him. A non-answer designed to pressure the governor into simply ratifying their verdict without examination. Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." They said, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." Pilate went inside and questioned Jesus directly. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus said, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said, "What is truth?" It is one of the most resonant questions in all of human history. Asked by a Roman official trying to manage a politically inconvenient situation in an occupied province. Asked in the presence of the one who had said, just hours before in the upper room, "I am the way and the truth and the life." Whether Pilate meant it philosophically or dismissively, the irony of the moment is impossible to miss. He was asking the question of the one person in the room who could have answered it. He went back out to the crowd and said, "I find no guilt in him." The crowd became more insistent. Learning that Jesus was from Galilee, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, who also happened to be in Jerusalem for Passover, and under whose jurisdiction Galileans fell. Herod was pleased to see him. He had heard many things about Jesus and was hoping to witness some miraculous sign. He questioned him at length. Jesus answered him nothing. Herod and his soldiers treated him with contempt, dressed him in fine clothing as a mockery, and sent him back to Pilate. Luke notes that Herod and Pilate, who had previously been at odds, became friends with each other that day. The man they were passing between them, mocking, had done nothing but be innocent. Pilate gathered the chief priests and rulers and the people together and said again, "I find no guilt in this man." Neither did Herod. He offered a compromise, saying he would have him flogged and then release him. And here the crowd introduced a custom. It was the practice during Passover for the Roman governor to release one prisoner as a gesture of goodwill. Pilate offered them the choice: Jesus, or a man named Barabbas who was in prison for insurrection and murder. He assumed they would choose Jesus. The chief priests persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas. Pilate said, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." Pilate said, "Why? What evil has he done?" They shouted all the louder, "Let him be crucified." At this point, a message arrived from Pilate's wife, sent while she sat at home. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." She had dreamed about him and woken disturbed, and sent word to her husband in the middle of his court proceedings. The crowd would not be quieted. Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, and that the situation was threatening to become the kind of public disorder that could cost him his position. He took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "See to it yourselves." The crowd answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Breathe. Let that exchange settle without rushing past it. Pilate, a Roman governor, using a Jewish gesture of ritual innocence to wash himself of a decision he was making anyway. A crowd choosing in the most public and irrevocable terms they knew to accept responsibility for what was happening. And between them, a man who had said from the beginning that this was the reason he had come. Pilate released Barabbas. He had Jesus flogged, and he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers took him into the courtyard and gathered there. They put a scarlet robe on him. They wove thorns into a crown and pressed it onto his head. They put a reed in his right hand. They knelt before him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him. They struck him on the head repeatedly with the reed. When they had finished, they stripped him of the robe, put his own clothes back on him, and led him out. The condemned man was required to carry the crossbeam to the place of execution. He walked out under it into the streets of Jerusalem. Somewhere on that road, under the weight and the accumulated trauma of the entire night and this morning, he fell. The soldiers needed the execution to proceed. They grabbed a man from the watching crowd. His name was Simon, from the city of Cyrene in North Africa. He was coming in from the country, the Gospels tell us, arriving in Jerusalem perhaps for the feast, not knowing what he was walking into. The soldiers put the crossbeam on Simon's shoulders and ordered him to carry it. Simon of Cyrene did not choose to be in this story. He was pulled from a crowd on a Friday morning in Jerusalem and given a weight that was not his, and made to walk a road he had not intended to walk. The Gospel of Mark mentions that Simon's sons were named Alexander and Rufus, a detail that scholars have noted likely means his readers in Rome would have known who these men were. Sons of the man who had carried the cross of Jesus on the road to Golgotha. They walked through the streets of Jerusalem toward the city gate. Among the crowd following were women who were weeping and mourning. Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Even on that road, even in that condition, He was thinking about them. They reached the place called Golgotha, an Aramaic word that means the place of the skull. It was outside the city walls, on an exposed hill near one of the main roads into Jerusalem, a place chosen by the Roman authorities specifically for its visibility. Crucifixion was not only an execution, it was a message, a warning displayed where as many people as possible would see it. This is what happens to those who challenge Rome. They offered him wine mixed with something bitter, a mixture sometimes offered to men facing crucifixion. He tasted it and refused it. He would face what was coming with a clear mind. It was 9 in the morning. Rest here. We will carry the full meaning of what happened on this hill into the next chapter, where we will sit with each of the words he spoke from the cross and what they mean for anyone listening tonight. But for now, rest with this. The road from Gethsemane to Golgotha has been walked. He walked every step of it by choice. He refused the thing that might have dulled what he was about to carry. Sleep now, if sleep is ready to come. What he carried on that road, he carried for you. Chapter 10. The Cross. The 7 words. Before we continue, let us slow down. Not to repeat what has already been told, but to go deeper into it. Because the 6 hours on the cross contained 7 things, he said, and each one of those 7 things is still speaking 2,000 years later to anyone willing to stop and listen. They were spoken outward, every one of them, toward the Father, toward the people around him, toward the criminal beside him, toward his mother, toward the weight of everything he was carrying. Not one of them turned inward in self-pity or complaint. Even dying, he was giving. Let us sit with each word. The cross was raised at 9 in the morning. Above his head, Pilate had ordered a sign placed, written in 3 languages, Hebrew and Latin and Greek, so that every person in Jerusalem, regardless of background, could read it. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The chief priests objected and went back to Pilate. Do not write the King of the Jews, they said. Write that he said, I am King of the Jews. Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. On either side of him, 2 criminals were crucified at the same time. The crowd that gathered did what crowds at Roman executions did. Some mocked. The chief priests and scribes and elders passed by and said, he saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we will believe in him. The first word was spoken almost immediately after the cross was raised, before the crowd had fully gathered, while the soldiers were crouching at the foot of the cross, dividing his garments among themselves and casting lots for his tunic. He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Breathe. He did not say this after the fact. He did not say it from a safe distance, looking back with the benefit of perspective. He said it while it was happening. While the nails were still fresh, while the men who had put them there were gambling over his clothing a few feet below him. Father, forgive them. Not because they deserve it, not because they have acknowledged what they have done, not even because they have stopped doing it, but because they do not fully understand the magnitude of what they are participating in. He prayed for the people killing him while they were in the process of killing him. If you have ever wondered whether the forgiveness offered through this cross is real, whether it actually extends to the worst things human beings are capable of, this is your answer. Spoken from the cross. While the event was still in progress, the second word was spoken to the man dying beside him. One of the 2 criminals being executed alongside him had been hurling insults earlier. But at some point during those hours, something shifted in him. He turned to the other criminal and said, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he turned to Jesus and said, Remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus said, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Not someday, not after sufficient waiting, Today, this man, who had done nothing his whole life to deserve what he was being offered, who had no credentials to present, who had only these last hours remaining and had spent part of them in mockery, was being received. Because he asked, just because he asked. The door that had been closed was opening while the cross was still standing. The third word was spoken to his mother and to John. Standing close by were the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. His mother Mary was there. Mary Magdalene was there, and the disciple whom Jesus loved, believed to be John, was with them. Jesus looked down and saw his mother. He said to her, "Woman, behold your son," and to John, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, John took her into his own home. Even here, even from this place, he was not so consumed by what was happening to him that he forgot what she would need when it was over. He was making provision for her future from the cross. This is a love that does not turn inward, even under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Breathe. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the land. What produced the darkness, and how it lasted for 3 hours, the Gospels record as fact. Some ancient writers outside the Gospels noted unusual events around this period, though the interpretation of these references is a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. What the Gospel accounts agree on is that the land went dark during these hours in a way that was outside the ordinary. The fourth word came from within that darkness. At 3 in the afternoon, he cried out, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me?" The opening words of Psalm 22, written by David 1,000 years before this day. A psalm that begins in the depths of felt abandonment and moves, over its full length, toward confident praise and the declaration that God has not hidden his face from the one who suffers, that he has listened to the cry for help. He was praying through the psalm, living it from the inside. Most careful readers of Scripture have understood this cry as expressing something more than physical suffering. He was bearing, in those hours, the full weight of human sin and its consequences. And sin, by its nature, separates. It separates the human heart from the holy presence. He was experiencing, from the inside, what sin does. Not his own sin, there was none, but the sin he was carrying. And he cried out about it honestly. But the psalm does not end in abandonment. It ends with praise. It ends with the declaration that God has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one, that he has listened to his cry. He prayed through the darkness all the way to that ending. The fifth word was simple. I am thirsty. The Gospel of John tells us he said this, knowing that all was now finished and that the Scripture might be fulfilled, connecting it to Psalm 69, which spoke of the suffering servant being given vinegar to drink. A jar of sour wine was nearby. Someone put a sponge full of it on a branch and held it to his mouth. He received the drink. He was thirsty. He was human. He said so. The sixth word was the one that contains everything. Tetelestai. It is finished. In the Greek commercial world of the 1st century, this word appeared on records of payment when a debt had been completely and fully settled, when nothing remained outstanding, when the account had been cleared entirely, paid in full. He was not saying I am defeated. He was declaring the task complete, the work done. The debt that no human being could settle on their own behalf, the debt of sin against the holiness of God, had been paid. Completely. Nothing outstanding. Nothing remaining. Paid in full. Breathe. Let that word rest in the room with you tonight. Whatever account you have been afraid to look at, whatever weight you have been carrying that felt too large and too permanent to ever be fully addressed, the sixth word is for you. Tetelestai. Not because you earned it. Not because you have cleaned up enough, or tried hard enough, or been good enough. Because he said it. Because the work is done, and the account is cleared, and nothing that was owed remains outstanding. The seventh and final word from the cross was a prayer. the last prayer of a life shaped by prayer from its very beginning. He had prayed in the wilderness before his ministry began. He had prayed through the night before choosing the 12. He had prayed on the mountain of transfiguration. He had prayed in Gethsemane until the anguish pressed itself into his body. And now, from the cross, with the last breath available to him, he prayed, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." It is a quotation from Psalm 31, a psalm that Jewish children were taught to recite as a nighttime prayer before sleep. The last words before closing their eyes, the entrusting of the self to the care of God through the dark hours. He died with a child's bedtime prayer on his lips. "Father, into your hands." And he breathed his last. The curtain in the temple tore. Ancient sources, including some historical and rabbinic texts, describe the temple curtain as a heavy and substantial piece of woven fabric, though the precise dimensions given in various sources differ, and scholars note these figures should be understood as traditional descriptions rather than verified measurements. What all four gospel accounts agree on is the significance of what happened. It tore from top to bottom, not from bottom to top, which is the direction of human hands reaching upward, from top to bottom. And what it had separated for centuries, the ordinary from the most holy, the human from the divine presence, was no longer separated. The way was open. The Roman centurion standing there, the man who had commanded the crucifixion, who had seen many executions in his career and understood the mechanics of them, looked at everything that had happened. The darkness, the way this man had died, the words that had come from the cross, none of which sounded like the words of a man being destroyed. He said, "Truly this was the Son of God," a Roman soldier, the representative of the empire that had just executed him, the last voice we hear before the body is taken down. Truly this was the Son of God. Joseph of Arimathea, described in the Gospels as a member of the council who had not consented to their decision and who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate confirmed with the centurion that Jesus was already dead and gave Joseph permission. A man named Nicodemus came with Joseph, bringing a mixture of spices for burial. This was the same Nicodemus who had come to Jesus at night years earlier with his questions, to whom Jesus had said, "You must be born again." He had been somewhere in the background of the story ever since. And now, at the end, he came into the open. They wrapped the body in linen cloths with the spices. Nearby was a garden with a new tomb cut from the rock, belonging to Joseph. The Sabbath was approaching. There was not time for the full burial rites. They placed him in the tomb. They rolled a stone against the door, and they left. The women who had been watching, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, sat across from the tomb and watched where he had been laid. The hill was quiet. The crowd was gone. The sky was moving toward evening. Two women sat across from a sealed tomb. 7 words from the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Today you will be with me in paradise. Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother. My God, why have you forsaken me? I am thirsty. It is finished. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Every one of them spoken outward. Every one of them given. Not one turned inward in complaint. The stone is in place. But the stone is not the last word. Sleep now. Saturday is one more night. And Sunday is coming. Chapter 11. Saturday, the day the world held its breath. There is no chapter in Holy Week harder to write than this one. Not because it contains the most suffering. Friday contained more suffering than any other day in the story. Not because it contains the most drama. Thursday evening contained drama that no one could have invented. Saturday is difficult because it contains something more disorienting than suffering and more unsettling than drama. It contains silence. The specific, particular silence of the day between death and resurrection. The silence of a sealed tomb. The silence of people who have watched the worst thing happen and have not yet received any indication that it is not, in fact, the final thing. The silence of a world that does not know yet, that cannot know yet. That has to wait through an entire day of not knowing. That is Saturday. And most of us know what Saturday feels like. The day after the diagnosis, when the treatment has not yet begun. The day after the loss, when the grief is new and has not yet been softened by any passage of time. The day after the failure, when you do not yet know if anything is going to be rebuilt. The day between what has ended and what has not yet come. Saturday is that day. Let us begin with what we know about where people were. The disciples were scattered. After the arrest in the garden, they had fled. Peter had followed at a distance to the high priest's courtyard and had denied Jesus 3 times and gone out weeping. John had been at the cross. The others had disappeared into the city and its surroundings, into whatever shelter was available to men who were afraid and grieving, and who had just watched everything they had given 3 years of their lives to come to an end on a hill outside the city walls. They were hiding. The Gospel of John, written with the perspective of decades, tells us that after the resurrection, the disciples were gathered with the doors locked for fear of the authorities. It is reasonable to assume that fear was present already on Saturday. The man they had followed had been executed as an enemy of the state. They had been his known associates. Being a disciple of Jesus on Saturday was not a comfortable identity to hold in Jerusalem. Peter was somewhere in the city with 3 denials and the sound of a rooster living inside him. The weight of those 3 moments around a charcoal fire in a courtyard, the weight of having looked someone in the eye and said, "I do not know the man," was the kind of weight that does not lighten quickly. John was with Mary, the mother of Jesus, because Jesus had given her into his care from the cross. They were together somewhere, in the particular quiet of people who have been through something too large and too recent to have found any words for yet. Mary Magdalene and the other women were thinking practically. We know this because early on Sunday morning they were already on their way to the tomb with spices to complete the burial rites that Friday's urgency had not allowed. This means they spent at least part of Saturday making arrangements, deciding what to bring, planning how to address the problem of the stone, doing the next faithful thing in the presence of a loss that had not yet been given any resolution. She was thinking practically about a dead man. That is what Saturday asks of you. The ordinary, terrible practicality of continuing to function in the presence of a grief that has not been resolved. You still have to buy the spices. You still have to eat something. The grief does not pause while you attend to the requirements of being alive. Breathe. Now there is a detail that most people overlook entirely when they think about Holy Week Saturday. The chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. On the Sabbath, the day they were not supposed to conduct business, the day of prescribed rest, they went to the Roman governor and said, "Sir, we remember how that deceiver said, 'While he was still alive, after 3 days I will rise.' Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead." Pilate said, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." They went and sealed the stone and set a guard. This detail is worth sitting with carefully. The religious leaders who had spent the entire week working to remove Jesus from public life remembered, after his death, that he had said he would rise after 3 days. They remembered it clearly enough to break their own Sabbath restrictions to take action against it. They were concerned enough about the possibility to seek a Roman seal and a Roman guard. The disciples, as far as the Gospel accounts suggest, were not acting on that same expectation on Saturday. They were hiding. They were grieving. They were not, apparently, sitting in a locked room anticipating Sunday morning. The people most afraid of the resurrection on Saturday were the people who had arranged the crucifixion. They sealed the tomb with a Roman seal and set soldiers to guard it. They did everything available to them. It was not enough. But we are not there yet. Breathe. On Saturday, the sealed tomb sat in the garden outside the city walls. The guards stood at their posts. The stone did not move. The morning passed. The afternoon passed. The sun moved across the sky as it always does. And inside a sealed cave cut from the rock, either something was happening that has no precedent in human experience, or the story was simply over. Saturday does not tell you which. Saturday offers you only the choice to keep waiting or to stop. And waiting is hard. There is a tradition in Christian theology, expressed in ancient creeds and developed across many centuries of careful reflection, that speaks of what may have happened between the death on Friday and the resurrection on Sunday. The ancient statement of belief that has been recited by Christians across many traditions for centuries includes the phrase, "He descended to the dead." Different theological traditions have understood this phrase differently, and the scriptural passages that touch on it are among the most carefully debated in the New Testament. What the tradition affirms, in its various forms, is that Saturday was not simply a pause in the story, that something was occurring in dimensions not visible to the people standing on the surface of events. We hold that tradition with appropriate humility about what exactly it means. But the larger point stands regardless of how one interprets the specific details. The sealed tomb was keeping the world out until the right moment. The stone was not keeping anything in. Breathe. What do you do with your Saturdays? The days between what has ended and what has not yet come. The days when the stone is in place and nothing visible has changed. The days when the practical requirements of living keep demanding your attention, while the deeper question of whether anything is going to be redeemed from this remains unanswered. The women prepared their spices and observed the Sabbath. They did the next faithful thing and they waited. They did not understand that Sunday was coming. They had no promise they were acting on consciously. They were going to the tomb to anoint a dead man because that was the faithful thing to do for someone you loved. And in their faithfulness, without knowing it, they were positioning themselves to be the first people in history to receive the news that changed everything. You do not always know, on your Saturdays, that Sunday is coming. You only know what the women knew, that the next faithful thing is still worth doing, that the tomb is still worth going to. Even when you do not know what you will find there, do the next faithful thing and wait. He is not absent from your Saturday. He never has been. Breathe. Let the day grow quiet around you. Let the stone sit where it is for now. Let the guards stand at their posts. Let the silence be silence without trying to fill it or fix it or resolve it before it is ready to be resolved. You are in good company on your Saturday. You are in the company of women preparing spices and a locked room full of frightened men and a mother who has lived through the worst day of her life and is still breathing. You are in the company of everyone who has ever had to spend a day not knowing. He knows your Saturday. He spent one himself, and he did not stay. Rest now. The night is almost over. The first day of the week is coming, and the women are already awake. Chapter 12. Sunday. The empty tomb. The darkness before dawn is the deepest darkness there is. Not the darkness of midnight, which has a settled quality to it, the world fully given over to night. The darkness before dawn is different. It is the darkness that exists in the last hour before everything changes. The darkness that does not yet know it is about to end. Mary Magdalene walked through that darkness toward the tomb. She was not alone. The other gospel accounts mention other women with her. Mary, the mother of James. Salome. Others. They had prepared their spices and spent the Sabbath waiting. And now, before the sun had risen, they were already moving through the streets of Jerusalem toward the garden outside the city wall, where they had watched the stone rolled into place 2 days before. They were talking about the stone as they walked. Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? It was a practical problem they had not solved. The stone was large. The Gospel of Mark describes it in terms suggesting it was notably substantial. They were not strong enough to move it themselves and had not arranged for help. They were walking toward an obstacle they did not know how to get past, because the alternative was not going at all. And not going was not something they were willing to consider. They went anyway. They arrived at the tomb and looked up. The stone had been rolled away. They had not rolled it. No human hand present had moved it. The Gospel of Matthew, writing from a slightly different vantage point and describing events from just before their arrival, records that there had been a great earthquake and that an angel of the Lord had descended and rolled back the stone. The guards, Matthew tells us, trembled and became like dead men. The stone that the Roman authorities had sealed with the full authority of the empire had been moved. Mary Magdalene ran. She did not stay to examine the tomb fully, or at least not immediately. She ran back toward the city to find Peter and John. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Her first interpretation of the empty tomb was not resurrection. It was theft. Someone had moved the body. The empty tomb, by itself, was not good news to Mary on that first Sunday morning. It was a new crisis layered on top of an already unbearable loss. Peter and John ran. John was faster and arrived first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen cloths lying there, but did not go in. Peter arrived and went straight inside, entirely consistent with everything we know about him, and he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the other cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Folded up. John went in after Peter, and John records 4 words about himself that carry the weight of a life changed in a single moment. He saw, and he believed. Not yet understanding the scripture, he writes. Not yet having a complete theological framework for what had happened. But looking at an empty tomb with the cloths lying as they were, something in what he saw was sufficient. Something in the details of what remained told him what the absence meant. He believed. Peter and John returned to their homes, but Mary stayed. She stood outside the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped to look in and saw 2 figures in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." She turned around. There was a man standing there. Through her tears, in the early morning light, she did not recognize him. She assumed he was the gardener, the person responsible for this garden. He said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." She was still working the problem, still thinking practically about how to complete what she had come to do. Even now, in her grief, she was the woman who had prepared the spices and planned the morning and arrived before sunrise. He said one word, "Mary," and she knew. Not because of the word itself, not because it was a coded signal, but because of the way he said it, the way only one voice in the world said her name. The particular quality of recognition in a voice that knows you completely, that has always known you, that called you by name long before this morning in the garden. She turned. She said, "Rabboni," teacher. She knew him by his voice saying her name. He said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Go." She was the first person in human history to receive the news of the resurrection. And she was sent, not told to wait or to defer to others who might understand better. She was sent. Go and tell. She went. She ran back into the city and found the disciples and said to them, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said. Breathe. Let those words stay with you. I have seen the Lord. The spoken testimony of a woman who loved him enough to be at the tomb before sunrise on a Sunday morning, when she had no reason to expect anything other than a sealed cave and a large stone. She loved him enough to go, and he loved her enough to be there, and to say her name. Now let us sit with what the resurrection means. Because the empty tomb is not simply one more miracle to be catalogued alongside the others. It is a different category of event entirely. He was not resuscitated the way Lazarus had been resuscitated and returned to ordinary mortal life in Bethany. The resurrection of Jesus was something that had never happened before and was categorically new. The body that appeared to Mary Magdalene in the garden, that appeared to Peter and to the disciples in the locked room, that appeared to 2 people on the road to Emmaus and later to a large gathering of people at once, according to the testimony the Apostle Paul records in his first letter to the Corinthians, was a real body. He ate fish with the disciples on the beach. Thomas touched his wounds. He was not a ghost or a vision. He was physical, but he was also different. He appeared in a locked room without using the door. He was not always immediately recognizable to people who had known him well. He moved in ways that suggest a body no longer constrained by the ordinary rules of space and time. He was the same person, with the same wounds, speaking the same voice that Mary had recognized in the garden. But he was inhabiting a new kind of existence. The first fruits, Paul would call him. The first of a harvest still coming. The resurrection of Jesus is, in the understanding of the New Testament, the prototype of what awaits every person who dies trusting in him. Not a disembodied existence in some spiritual realm. A body. A real, physical, recognizable body, transformed into something that mortality cannot contain. A new kind of existence in which the best things about the old one are preserved and the worst things are gone. Death was not the end. Death was the doorway. And on Sunday morning in a garden outside Jerusalem, the door had been walked through from the other side. Breathe. 2 disciples walked 7 miles that day from Jerusalem toward a village called Emmaus, not knowing they were walking beside the risen Jesus. He walked with them. He listened to them describe, with grief and confusion, everything that had happened over the past week. He asked them questions. He let them talk. And then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And their hearts burned within them. That phrase, their hearts burned within them. Not a theological argument that left them no choice. Not a miracle that forced belief. Something warmer and more personal than either. A burning in the chest that came before full understanding. A recognition felt before it was thought. He broke bread with them at the table that evening, and their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he was gone from their sight. They got up immediately, in the dark, and went back the 7 miles to Jerusalem to tell the others. He had been with them the whole way. They had not known it, and yet their hearts had burned. Perhaps that is the most personal part of the resurrection story for anyone lying awake tonight. Not the stone and the soldiers and the folded cloths, as extraordinary as those things are, but the road to Emmaus. 2 people walking through their grief, through their 7 miles of not knowing, and the whole time the one they were grieving was beside them, listening, speaking, their hearts burning within them and not yet knowing why. He walks with people through their grief before they know it is him. He was doing it on Sunday. He has never stopped. Breathe. The disciples gathered that Sunday evening in a locked room, and Jesus came and stood among them. Peace be with you. He showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. He said again, Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you. He breathed on them. Receive the Holy Spirit. The same image as Genesis, where the breath of God brought life to the first human being. A new beginning, a new creation, initiated with a breath. Thomas was not there that first Sunday evening. He refused to believe the reports of the others, until he could see the wounds himself. 8 days later, Jesus came again, and Thomas was there. Jesus said to him, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That is you. You were not in the upper room that Sunday evening. You did not see the wounds. You did not walk the road to Emmaus or sit with him at breakfast on the beach in Galilee in the mornings that followed. You have the testimony of the witnesses, the account of the empty tomb, the burning in the chest that sometimes comes when the words of the scriptures are opened up, and the particular presence that makes itself known in the quiet of a room at the end of a long day. You have not seen, and yet you are here. At the end of this week, having walked from Bethany to Jerusalem, to the upper room, to the garden, to the cross, to the sealed tomb, to the garden again in the early morning dark, where a woman heard her name and turned and knew. He called people like you blessed, not the ones who demanded evidence and received it before they would believe. The ones who heard and believed, the ones whose hearts burned within them on the road. The ones who opened the window in the morning toward the place where God had promised to be, without always being able to see clearly whether anything was coming. He called that faith. He called it blessed. Breathe. The resurrection does not answer every question. It does not explain why suffering exists, or why prayers sometimes seem to go unanswered, or why the Saturday silences can last so much longer than they feel like they should. It does not make the grief disappear, or the confusion resolve, or the practical problems of ordinary life suddenly simple. What it does is this. It establishes, in the most concrete and irreversible terms available, that death is not the final word. That the worst thing that can happen is not the last thing that will happen. That the stone can be rolled away. That the voice that knows your name has not gone silent. That the one who said, "Let not your hearts be troubled," meant it, and has the authority to mean it, because he went into the worst that death could do and came out the other side. The empty tomb is the answer to every Saturday. Not an explanation, an answer. He is risen, and he knows your name. Rest now. You have walked every step of this week, and you have not walked it alone.
You have walked the whole week, from the road out of Galilee to the voices on the hillside singing their Passover psalms, to the table where feet were washed, to the garden where the cup was accepted, to the cross where every word was given outward, to the tomb where the stone was rolled away before anyone arrived to move it. You have been through all of it, and now it is late. The week is finished, and you are here. Let us pray. Father, we come to you at the end of this week with gratitude that does not have a sufficient shape in words. Thank you for the road from Galilee, for the one who walked it knowing what was waiting at the end of it, and who walked it anyway. Thank you for the voices that cried Hosanna, even when they did not yet understand what kind of saving they were asking for. You heard them, and you hear us too. Thank you for the upper room, for the basin and the towel, for the bread and the cup, for words spoken into confusion that would only make sense later. Thank you that those words are still true. Thank you for Gethsemane, for honest prayer without pretense, for the nevertheless, for strength given, not to escape the cup, but to carry it. There is someone resting with these words tonight, who has prayed in the dark and has not yet received the answer they hoped for. Be present with them, not with explanations, with presence. You know how to do this. You have done it before. Thank you for the cross, for forgiveness spoken while it was still happening, for mercy given to a man with nothing but a request, for care extended even in suffering, for the cry that reached into the Psalms and carried all the way through, for thirst spoken honestly, for tetelestai, paid in full. Whatever weight is being carried tonight, let that word be enough, not because it was earned, because it was spoken. Thank you for Saturday, for the silence that was not absence, for the waiting that did not mean the story was over, for the faithfulness of those who kept going without knowing what was coming next. There is someone here tonight living in a long Saturday. Be present in that waiting. Let them know this is not the end of your story, and it is not the end of theirs. Thank you for Sunday morning, for the stone already moved, for a name spoken in a garden at dawn, for peace in a locked room, for hearts that burned before understanding came, for those who have not seen and yet believe. That blessing is for them tonight. Breathe. He is not here. He is risen. Let that be enough. Let your body rest now. Let your mind grow quiet. The week is complete. The work is finished. The tomb is empty. Good night, beloved. You have walked every road of this story, and you have not walked a single step of it alone. He is risen, and He is with you, now and always. Amen.